Okay.
Recording in progress.
All right. So, hello everybody. I'm Birch, and I'll be presenting tonight on the topic of King Arthur. Specifically, we're going to be talking about some of the stories of the Round Table and the characters such as Merlin. And then we're going to look at the possible Celtic origins of some of these stories. Kind of like pulling the sword from the stone, so to speak. So, as you can imagine, there's going to be a lot to unpack here. So I'm not going to get everyone's favorite story in. I'm sorry, I had to leave a few of my own favorites out, but I did get my very favorite, yes, because I'm doing a presentation. So just to kind of start off with, since we are kind of doing a deep dive into the history, I thought it'd be cool to kind of talk about the history of King Arthur to the best of our knowledge, because unfortunately, the 5th and 6th centuries, when King Arthur would have lived, were a true dark age in Britain. There's pretty much no written documents from that time contemporary. There's one writer whose work survives, Gildas, and he is more interested in a sermon than actually giving us history. But I am, of course, very thankful for Geoffrey of Monmouth and his history of the kings of Britain, because that is a wealth of fascinating information on the subject. So if you guys remember the Beltane presentation, I told you about the year 410 AD, when the Roman legions left the island of Britain, which for the last 400 years had been a Roman colony. And at that point, those Roman Britain, Celtic, were left to their own devices, and the invading Saxons and Angles and Jutes and Irish all decided that was ripe for the picking, so they started to invade. And I promised you that I'd be talking more about what happened next. So, as you can imagine, it seemed like nothing could stop this Saxon invasion. And yet all the historical evidence shows someone did stop it, and not just stop it, but completely send the Saxons back either to the coast or all the way back to Germany for at least a full generation, sometime around the end of the 5th, beginning of the 6th century. And that person is who seems to have gone down in history as King Arthur Pendragon. So, according to the version in Geoffrey of Monmouth, who was writing around the year 1100, it started with a man called Aurelius Ambrosius, who was the son of a royal Roman family who was born shortly after the Roman legions would have left, but he had originally gone to a wealthy Roman family, perhaps even a royal family. And in this version of the story, Aurelius was the son of Constantine, and his throne was usurped at the age of when he was 10 years old by Vortigern. And Vortigern basically told the Saxons, hey, come over here and help me establish my throne. And then he used the Saxons to prop himself up. But of course, since he didn't have an army of his own really, except for the Saxons, they were able to twist his arm and get more and more concessions from the British until Aurelius came back, fought the Saxons off, and left it there. According to most of the legends, Aurelius Ambrosius then died of poison shortly after this. He was buried by Merlin at Stonehenge, and his brother, Uther Pendragon, became the king of Britain. And if you guys know the Arthurian story, of course, Uther was the legendary father of King Arthur. So King Arthur then would have been this Aurelius Ambrosius's nephew, if the history as it's best recorded is true, and the timing on it is about right, because it seems as a period of maybe about 70 years or so that a few of these forts were defended and maintained. And of course, that's more than one person's lifetime, but you could see if, one person rebuilt the fort, defended, drove the Saxons back. Another king took over. A third king took over after that. You could see a 70-year period making a lot of sense. So anyway, that is the kind of the best guess we have for what might have been the historical germ of truth for the Arthurian legend. And so then let us get started here. So first I want to talk, of course, about Merlin. Druids in the room?
Yeah.
You guys like Merlin, don't you?
Yes.
Well,
Some
here's
say he might have been the father of Druidism.
that's somewhat they say, yes. So when you think of Merlin, let me guess, you have this image of a Merlin like in Disney's Sword in the Stone, right? Long white beard, pointy hat, flowy robes, maybe
Actually,
a little eccentric.
I don't see him like that. I see him like the 1980s movie one
Ah, the 1980s Merlin.
with a metal dome head.
Okay. Yes. And yeah, maybe, or again, like Druid, worshiping the old gods, kind of maybe even like in the midst of Abelina, the last of a line of Druids as Christianity was coming in. Well, how many of you imagine a Welsh king who, after a battle where his friends and his relatives were slain, was driven mad and ended up running off into the forest with what was probably an extreme case of PTSD? Because that is actually one of the possible historical Merlins, a Merlin of Wales, a king who, after the battle, he basically ran off into the woods and, unfortunately, like happens to a lot of people in wartime, went crazy. And then in a lot of the stories after that, he'd come back, he's a bit of a trickster, a bit of a riddler, a bit of prophecy, but it was all because he had been driven crazy at this battle. And of course, he wasn't even Merlin. Again, my old friend Joffrey, he decided that he was going to have to change Merlin Emery's name because he was writing in Latin to a mainly French-speaking audience as their vernacular language. Well, guess what? If you make Merlin, which is a Welsh name, into Latin, you will come up with Merthinus. And Merthinus is basically the French word for shit. So since he couldn't have an enchanter named Shitty going around being a bard, because no one would ever want to read that book. Maybe you do, I don't know. But because of that, he had to change the name. So he decided Merlin was pretty close. And Merlin, like the Vulcan, the hawk, bird, air, good symbolism. So he renamed Merlin when he was writing his book. And he actually wrote an entire book about the life of Merlin, the Vita Merlani, where he talks about how the king was driven mad and went off into the woods and befriended a pig and a wolf and lived in a ruined tower. But there's also, interesting enough, a poet also named Merlin, who lived around the same time, and he wrote some really beautiful poems. One of them is called The Apple Trees. And it's interesting because in Mary Stuart's retelling of the Merlin legend, she actually has her Merlin living in a place called Applegar, surrounded by apple trees. So now I'm like, oh, I see where she got the apple trees from. And also in Joffrey, he talks about when Merlin was a young boy. He was the son of an incubus and a Welsh princess who was also a nun. And because he was born of no man, when Vortigern, the usurper, needed to fortify a tower with the blood of a person born of no man, and his soldiers heard another boy taunting young Merlin, hey, you have no father. The soldiers grabbed the boy and carried him off to Dinas Emrys. And at Dennis Embry's, they were going to put him to death and sacrifice him to cover his blood on the stones. However, this young Merlin had a trick up his sleeve because he also had the sight through his father. So in this story, he then basically outwitted the priests of Vortigern and said, hey, they can't tell you why your tower's falling down, but I can. There's two dragons at the bottom of the pool, a red dragon and a white dragon. And these two dragons are fighting each other. And so that's why every day when they build the tower, it falls down, because the dragons have knocked it down. And then they drained the lake, and sure enough, there were two dragons underneath, a white dragon and a red dragon. And for a time, you know, they were fighting. The white dragon, the red dragon looked like it won, but in the end, the red dragon looked like it was winning, but in the end, it was the white dragon who triumphed. So that was basically the prophecy of what was going to happen with the Saxons. That for a time, it would, you know, it would look like they were winning, but in the end, or I think the dragon first. The red dragon in the end would win, and the red dragon is the dragon who is still on the flag of Wales. So if you look at the Welsh flag, you see the dragon there. That is the dragon that Merlin Embry's prophesied about, saying that in the end the red dragon would triumph.
Nice.
So I thought that was kind of interesting because, you know, it's kind of like there's a few different versions of Merlin out there, but in all of them he's the same, like very wise, very learned. And I love the way that Dan the Bard puts it in his song Merlin Am I.
Oh,
Merlin
yes.
am I know the secrets of the land and the sky, and you'll hear my voice in the eagle's cry, Merlin am I. And in that song, he also references apple trees.
Yes, and he also references going mad.
Yes, he talks about the story of when he went mad in the woods. He talks, I think he mentions the pig too. Because when Merlin went mad in the woods, he found this little pig with a broken leg, and he healed the pig and fixed its leg, and then it became the enchanter's pig. So you can see how over the centuries Merlin may have changed and the stories of Merlin may change, but he is really synonymous now with a lot of knowledge, with the sky, the air. He's considered, again, yes, the very first druid by some, or some, you know, maybe one of the last of the druids, depending on who you talk to. And this image of a powerful wizard with foresight, a love of nature, and a long white beard has become a model for the way to live for many people of the Celtic path. You know, that inspiration. Yes, Ken?
So, interesting thought here.
Mhm.
With some research that I've done, it seems like it's one of those cases where the paganism was overtaken by the Christianity. So at some point in this story of Merlin, it was attributed to all the pagan things we recognize. However, sometime around the advent of Christianity in the kingdom, it almost seems like the story became allegorical towards the 12 apostles and Jesus kind of thing in the round table. They couldn't really do anything with it, so they kind of seem like they merged
Yes,
the Christianity into
we're
it.
going to get to that in the next two stories. Yes, very good, because that is exactly what this next story is about. So thank you for that tradition. The Holy Grail. Sounds about as Christian as it gets, doesn't it? Oh wait, there's more. So to really look at the Grail legend, you want to go all the way back to the very, very first Grail story, written in the 12th century by Chrétien de Troyes. Chrétien was a French poet, but he lived in Brittany, which had been settled by Welsh and Cornish people during the Saxon invasion because it was a little bit safer in Gaul. So they settled there, and therefore the Brittany, Lesser Britain, was very close culturally speaking to Wales and Cornwall. And especially after the Norman invasion of England in 1066, those bonds were renewed and strengthened again. So Chrétien learned a lot of his Arthurian stories from old stories of the Welsh and Cornish bards who were in Brittany at the time. And so in what is a Celtic twist to an otherwise extremely Christian allegory, we find that the Christian allegories came later because Chrétien died with his Grail story unfinished. And like what happens a lot when there's a really good story that ends without being finished, other writers were like, "Ooh, I can finish the story. I can finish the story. I can finish the story." So suddenly Robert de Baron decided, "Ooh, I know. I'm going to make the Grail, the Holy Grail of Jesus Christ, and have Joseph of Arimathea bring it all the way from the Holy Land to Avonlea." Yes! And that version became so popular that that one dominated the Grail story for the rest of history, all the way down to Monty Python.
That's my grass.
However, there is another Grail story by Chrétien, which I will now share with you. A young hero named Parzival embarks on a series of adventure in quest of glory and honor. Yet because he was young and often said the wrong thing, because he was raised in a nunnery and his first exposure to knights was, when they stopped by his garden and whatnot. He didn't quite know what he was doing, but he knew he had to be polite and mind his tongue. One day while questing, this young hero, who was recently made a knight of the Round Table, saw two men in a boat at anchor, fishing, and he asked them for directions, and one of them was a crippled king, known hereafter in the story as the Fisher King. He was the king of a castle beyond the drawbridge in the island, past this misty river. Lots of mist in the air, right? So that night, Percival decides he's going to stay at the castle, and as he sits at the feasting hall, he sees some mysterious treasures go past him into another room with a closed door. First, there was a white and bleeding lance. Then there were two golden candle holders. Third, there was a grail. It glowed with so great a light that candles suddenly seemed to grow dim, like the moon and stars when the sun appears in the sky. Just like that, we have a grail. But that is all he says about it for the moment. It is not yet the Holy Grail, because that was Robert's invention, but is a grail which, we find out later, was being used to keep the Fisher King's elderly father alive in that other room. And the castle was under a spell. And until someone asks questions about that object, the spell will not be broken. So at this point in the story, Percival goes to sleep, doesn't ask any questions because he's trying to be polite. He falls asleep. He wakes up. The castle is gone. And then the drawbridge is there. He gets across. The horse barely makes it over the drawbridge before it comes up, and then it all vanishes. And so he has to go questing for a while and find an old hermit who will tell him what's going on. He eventually makes it back to the Grail Castle, and he, asks the right questions, and he learns all the secrets, which is that this Grail can do magical things. It can produce wondrous amounts of food wherever it is located. It can keep a person alive even if they are near death. But the story ends before you know any more. And speaking of Monty Python from earlier, I'm pretty sure the creepy old guy at the end of Monty Python who was asking the riddles was based on the Fisher King. Because he's kind of like bent over and, hobbling about.
There are some who call me Tim.
Yes, Tim the Enchanter, of course. But yeah, so does this particular grail, as I described in Chrétien's story, remind you of any other objects you might have heard of in Celtic lore?
The
cauldron?
Carradwin's cauldron.
Carradwin's cauldron?
Oh, yeah.
And Dagda's cauldron.
Then there's also
Dagda's cauldron, yeah.
the
Yes.
thought of bringing food
No.
or a cornucopia possibly.
Yeah.
It's a combination because Dagda's cauldron was
The food.
was food, and Carradwin's cauldron was not necessarily life,
But
but
if you
Wisdom.
went in, yeah, wisdom, there's another cauldron, that was used in,
It was.
that will
It
keep
was
you
the
alive.
It was, yeah, it was based on the water chalice, and the chalice is the one that if you put yourself into
You
any
will,
wound is healed.
yes. And so, again, you see, even though it's a very Christian story of an allegory later on, there's some interesting other ties to Celtic mythology here too. The castle of the Fisher King, lying beyond the water, sounds a lot like some other islands and castles we've come across in Celtic lore. First one I thought of was where Cuchulainn went to be trained on the island across the river where he learned to become a warrior. There's also the story I came across the Mabinogion of Bran the Blessed. So Bran was killed with a poisoned spear, but he told his friends and men at arms to behead him and carry his head away because the head would be able to protect Britain. And of course, in that case, just like and in that story, it is Pereador. There's a story of Pereador, who would be Percival in French, who also finds a severed head in one of his stories. So there's definitely, you definitely see we had some Celtic inspiration here and there and kind of worked it all together. But speaking of disembodied heads, that brings us to my favorite story, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Particularly the Simon Armitage translation, but I also like reading in the original Middle English, even though I can't understand all the words. I can understand enough. And there's translations on the next page. So, there's going to be another pop quiz here. It is late December. A court led by a king often associated with the summer and the light, because of his name, is challenged by a green knight bedecked with holly and ivy leaves, who is green from head to foot. This green knight challenges Arthur's court to a contest. Whoever beheads him at this winter feast may do so without any struggle, but they must agree to have their head chopped off exactly 1 year later, blow for blow, on New Year's Eve day of the following year. What kind of story does this remind you of? Anyone?
Um,
King and Holly.
The old king and holly
the
thing,
oak
right?
and holly thing, but also
Yeah, the oak king and the holly king. That was when I read this first time. I was like, wait, hold on. He's green. He has holly, and as you get further in the book, he's like a great hunter too. I'm like, yeah, he's definitely a holly king. And so in this story, it is young Gawain who will one day grow up to be probably the greatest of Arthur's knights, except for Lancelot, who's a later French edition.
Makes sense.
But because the French writers had to have their own guy be the best, so that makes sense. So Gawain ends up taking up the challenge. It's a really interesting part next. Basically, he grabs the axe, he chops off the Green Knight's head. The Green Knight then picks up his head, and the head says, "I will see you next year at the Green Chapel." And then rides off on his all green horse. And so Gawain is then forced to go leave Camelot, wander far and wide, and asking everywhere for where the Green Chapel might be. And eventually he comes on Christmas Day to a castle in northern England, northern Wales, kind of in the Lake District, basically. And when he gets there, the lord of the castle invites him in, and they come up with a deal that every day, because apparently the Green Chapel is just hours right away, conveniently enough. So every day, whatever the lord of the castle wins on his hunts, he will give to Gawain, and whatever Gawain wins, laying a bed and sleeping in because he's tired, he's been wandering for a year, he will give to the lord of the castle. So you have like 3 days of these amazing hunting scenes where the lord of the castle is just killing animals right and left, deer, boar, hunting. And meanwhile, Gawain is lying in bed while the lady of the castle tries to seduce him. The first day, he limits her to just 1 kiss. And then, so at the end of the day, the lord of the castle gives Gawain all these dead animals, and Gawain gives him a kiss on the cheek.
That was his conquest.
That was what he wanted. That was what he gave. So the second day, 4 animals, 2 kisses on the cheek.
Uh-oh.
Third day, it's the day before he's about to go off. He's about to go off at noon that day, the next day to, get his head chopped off. And this time the lady of the castle tries to seduce him, but she offers him a green girdle that if he wore it, he wouldn't be killed. So at the end of that night, the lord of the castle gives him all these animals, freshly hunted, and he gives him 2 kisses on the cheek, but no green girdle.
It never fails to amaze me about English prudery of this time. Everything in the world, but for a kiss. It's this transaction has got to be fine.
He was trying to maintain the purity and not being an adult girl. He's doing his best. So then, just to kind of round out the story here, what happens next is he is led to the Green Chapel, and the Green Knight appears again with the axe and the holly and all the accoutrements of the trade, and Gawain flinches at the first one, and the axe misses. Flinches at the second, axe misses. He's taunted. Oh, you coward! I stood there and had my head cut off and weakly. So Gawain says, "Okay, I got this." So he holds himself still. The axe comes down and it nicks him on the neck, but doesn't chop off his head. All of a sudden, the Holly King is transformed, and it becomes the lord of the castle, standing there. Ooh, right? And he says, "All right, the first day you kept our bargain. The second day you kept our bargain. So the first 2 swings I made to miss, but the third one you gave me the kisses, but you didn't give me the girdle that I now see around your waist. So I could have cut off your head, but because you're only human, I'll let you have a pass on this one because you didn't want to die." And so that's why he just nicked the neck. And so Gawain returns to Camelot, wiser, better traveled, and wearing a green girdle for the rest of his days. So it's an interesting story because, first of all, there's a lot of 3s and 5s that keep coming up all over this book.
Yes.
The meter pattern, if you read it, it's exactly perfect. 5 beats, 5 lines, everything, except for the one point where he slips up and doesn't give over the girdle that he had worn that day. It's the only point where the meter breaks, because Gawain himself fails, which is why I think this poet was utterly brilliant, whoever he was in the 14th century, at the height of the alliterative revival. But then again, I also find interesting all the recurrence of the number 3. The 3 swings of the axe, the 3 days. Because 3 also, of course, comes up a lot when you talk about Celtic myth and legend. You always come across that number 3. The 3 faces of the goddess.
3 times 3.
3 times 3.
The truck by truck.
Yep, the triquetra. So it's interesting because the Triskelion. Because in this book, written in the 14th century, you can really see, where the original pattern would have been. They cover it up. It's actually a really funny cover story. I'll tell you guys. So the cover story, to explain the magic and everything, is that Morgan Le Fay, Arthur's sister, wanted to scare Guinevere to death And that's why someone dressed in green with a bunch of pollen showed up at Arthur's castle.
Stretching it now, are they?
It's like, really?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, right.
That's the best we come up with?
Laziness.
Best cover story you've got? So
Still,
it is a pretty funny cover story, but yeah. So anyway, I hope, so that's what I've got as my examples for tonight. I hope, when you read the Arthurian now, you can kind of see, especially with the Grail story, be like, that's really cards with cauldron. Don't be so sneaky about it. Now, of course, there is way more to talk about with Arthur, but I'm not going to go into everything tonight. However, I wanted to drop a buzz in people's ear that there is a lot of information about druids and their links to King Arthur. So if anyone wants to research that and do another class, there's a lot of interesting information there. So,
Also, the last time I was listening to Dan the Bard and one of his things, you mentioned it, the noggin,
Mobonagi, Mabinogion,
he's doing the whole thing.
yes,
yes.
it is
He did
awesome.
book 1, book 2. He did book 3. I think he's working on book 4.
Yeah. So if you want to get a rehash the Mabinogion, just listen to live Dan the Bard. And you'll feel
Yeah.
it.
He has them in songs, but what's
Well, he has like those albums.
albums?
Like one is Branch One, and it talks about the Pride Day. And okay, side note, but Pride Day. So one of my favorite books when I was a little kid was Dog's Body by Diana Wynne Jones. And at one point, Sirius, basically the dog star is turned into a dog on Earth as punishment for a crime he didn't commit. And so he's trying to learn about what he is. So he steals he gets the girl who has adopted him to read him this book. And she reads these lines about these dogs with red fur, with white fur and shining red ears. And it's quoted there. And when I read the Mabinogion, I came across those 3 lines. I was like, oh my gosh, you read the Mabinogion.
It's all coming together.
I'm like, yes. And it turns out he was actually half one of Auron's dogs and half Labrador. And he actually runs in the wild hunt and you meet Auron at the end of the book. It's awesome. So any questions? I know I kept it short tonight, but I've got a flight in the morning.
We all have to get up at 4.
Yes.
Good grief.
So
Alrighty then.
any questions, guys?
No, thank you very much for the presentation.
Stop
The
the
only thing I've
recording.
ever read about Arthur is list of Avalon.
Yeah, I